appreciate this. And welcome to all those who are attending remotely via Zoom. I appreciate your being here, even though I can't see most of you. I want to welcome you. I want to start by acknowledging with thanks Professor Kaplan for this invitation and for his many courtesies over the years as we worked on this together, including accommodating to the pandemic by use of Zoom, and also the modest scheduling accommodation necessitated by the end of spring break, both at Vanderbilt and apparently at Illinois. I also want to thank Heather Ball, the Director of Events and Alumni Programming, Carolyn Turner, the Assistant Dean for Administration, and Carrie Mae Borich, the Events Coordinator, for the logistical support and their good cheer in making this happen and arriving at this space. So thank you all. And I want to start, as I often do, about the importance, especially in an interdisciplinary area like health law and policy, of promoting the understanding and developing common terminology in a cross-disciplinary setting. And a number of years ago, it's been a couple of decades by now, a distinguished British jurist was visiting at Vanderbilt, and he reported on this story that the British courts were trying to improve their data keeping, and they sent out a questionnaire to the chief judge of each district, and this was what one chief judge responded. He said, was asked rather, please list the members of your court broken down by sex. And the chief judge of this particular district answered, says, there are none broken down by sex. Said, there are 2 broken down by age and 3 broken down by alcohol, but none broken down by sex. So you need to have some kind of common understanding of terminology if you're going to have effective communication. I think that's a good story that brings that to mind. My topic, as Professor Kaplan said, is ways of thinking about medical care, alternative models and structures, and their policy significance. And I just want to highlight and kind of break down, if you will, the talk into 4 broad categories. There'll be more, but I think these 4 categories capture the sum and substance of what I'm going to be talking about. First, I want to introduce different ways of thinking about medical care. And first, how language shapes the perception and the different paradigms, the professional and the market paradigm. Then secondly, I want to examine some of the consequences that, from a policy perspective, of the various assumptions undergirding the professional paradigm that has really been the traditional paradigm in the way we think of medical care. Then third, I want to introduce an alternative model to the Medicaid model, and that's from the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP. And then finally, Tennessee has been a pioneer in Medicaid program and introducing economic considerations, managing costs. And Tennessee recently applied for a little over a year ago, and then in January received approval for a waiver that basically embraces the CHIP model for Medicaid. So that's really the outline of the talk. But before I get to the meat, I want to say some things. It's hard to teach in this area and speak in this area and write in this area without developing some broader considerations and concerns. And I want to introduce what I consider to be the 2 intellectual megacepts of health policy. That is, whether government has an obligation to assure equality in access to care or to assure adequacy. Another way of saying this is whether there should be a unitary system or a pluralistic system. I don't want to talk about this for the main part of what I do, but just for completeness to say this is one of the major intellectual issues in health policy over time. And I'm just going to run through this quickly. The question is whether, if we really believe in equality, whether to level up to the level of Bill Gates and his family. This is expensive, and it's of questionable priority for spending to level everyone up to the Gates level. The other option would be to level down, prohibiting Bill Gates to spend his own funds to achieve better quality.
Ooh. Looks like he's muted.
Professor, can you unmute yourself?
I'm sorry, is that better?
Perfect.
Have I been speaking into the wind for all this time?
No, very, very shortly. Please continue.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't see it. I don't think I pushed any button either.
You're fine.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about this equality versus adequacy issue and whether we should have a unitary or pluralistic system. If one really takes seriously equality, there are only two ways to do it. You can either level up or level down. You can level up to the Bill Gates's level, which is expensive and of questionable priority, or you can level down. You can prohibit Bill Gates from spending his own funds to achieve better quality or better access, and this is highly coercive, or you can have some hybrid of the both. The focus in our country has been on access to an adequate level of services, and the debate has been about how we define what is an adequate level of services. That we recognize there can be differences, and the question is whether those differences can be narrow or great, and in what areas, in what scope. The Affordable Care Act does this by developing a comprehensive set of benefits and uses the term essential benefits to suggest that the adequacy level is defined up, but it recognizes very importantly that the key here is there an opportunity for supplementation? Without the opportunity for supplementation, then we're in a coercive system of leveling down. And the Affordable Care Act, Section 1302B5, expressly allows for supplementation. So the ACA strategy was to accept the adequacy idea and then to level up the adequacy idea to narrow the gaps between those who are well situated and those who are not so well situated. So that's all one megacept in health policy and law, and that's not what I'm going to be focusing on today. The second is the role of economic considerations in medical decision-making. This is the focus of my talk. And when I started, I remember years and years ago, a doctor said, it's nice to have someone like you involved in a program to think that economics has a role to play in medical decision-making, but you should know that economics has no role to play in economic decision-making. And he literally patted me on the head saying it's nice to have a diversity of viewpoint, but we all know that how silly you are. This would not happen today. There have been differences in perspective, but it's important to remember that history and that heritage. All right, I now want to talk about different ways of thinking about medical care and the importance of language in shaping perceptions. I like to tell a story about the old Soviet Union when the USSR and the US were involved in a car race, just the two of the countries. And this is how the results were reported in the government-controlled media in the Soviet Union. We are proud to recognize that there was a car race in which the US and the USSR were involved. The USSR, we're proud to report, finished second, and the US finished next to last. So think about that. Who won the race? Language can clarify, but language can mislead or it can misshape. So I think language is important. I want to talk here about two language points. One is, how do we refer to this area? Do we refer to it as a healthcare delivery system or non-system for those who object to it? or a healthcare industry. And then secondly, the distinction between rationing and allocating resources. A system suggests a social services delivery model. A non-system is a pejorative that connotes that there should be an organized system, but that there is not one. An industry suggests an economic sector in which principles of economics have application, principles of supply, demand, use of incentives, consideration of trade-offs. These become the terms of analysis. The non-system terminology has limited applicability in the context of a market. We don't think of a personal computer delivery system or a system of even legal services delivery. We think instead of markets for personal computers or legal services, and they are not necessarily organized along social services system lines. Turning to rationing versus allocating resources, economists will tell us, are always allocated to their most efficient use in a functioning market. Decisions are decentralized to households and firms, and resource allocation decisions are not made in a conscious or collective sense in a market. Rather, resource allocation decisions are observed after the fact by national income accountants who tell us how we spent our money last year or last quarter. The use of the term ration in the healthcare arena is used as a rhetorical pejorative and submerges a whole host of value judgments. It suggests a certain type of resource allocation method, a centralized decision by a government or other independent decision maker such as a doctor. It also suggests a consciously determined set of criteria that are distinct from typical supply and demand considerations that control in the marketplace. For example, do we ask whether Whole Foods or Kroger rations food, or whether the local car dealership rations access to the automobiles on the lot? The point is that an array of value judgments is being made when the terminology shifts from resource allocation to rationing. And the use of language blurs those value judgments. That is, the significance of the normative concerns we have for access considerations, considerations of egalitarianism and so forth, and concern about the role of economic factors in the decision-making process. So these political or ideological tensions are manifest in different ways of thinking about medical care, about the different models, the professional model and the market model. And I want to turn to those now. I don't want to make the case that it's an either-or proposition. These are broad categories. I think it's wrong to think of these ways of thinking of medical care as either market or professional. I think both exist, and we're talking more about where to place the emphasis, where to draw the line along a continuum. I like to tell Yogi Berra stories, and he was once asked, what is more important in baseball, physical ability or mental attitude? Yogi thought for a moment and then responded. He said, 90% of the game is mental. The other half is physical. And Yogi was a great philosopher, not too good at math. In the healthcare arena, I would say that 90% of the issue is professional, or some would say that 90% of the issue is professional. The other half is economic. So now I want to turn to describing the models. The professional model and its implications and assumptions reflects an approach to perceived market failure. It observes the lack of knowledge on the part of consumers, we used to call that ignorance, and the scientific expertise of physicians. The professional model substitutes professional control of decision-making for that of consumers. This vests enormous authority to determine quality and the volume of services and ultimately costs on professional providers. The assumption is that patients are uninformed and cannot really become well informed about medical care decisions. And so this is what we call, or Professor Kenneth Arrow used to call, the asymmetry of information. Patients are not informed, they're ignorant, and they cannot become informed. Again, I think about the story of a person on the street. It was a man on the street. I saw this interview a few years ago, and the reporter asked this fellow, "What is the worst problem today regarding the political process? Voter ignorance or voter apathy?" And the guy in response said, well, you know, I don't know, and I don't care. And that basically is the assumption of the professional model, paraprofessional paradigm. And as I've said, it's invested enormous authority in professionals to make fundamental decisions regarding medical care. Further, a further assumption is that diagnosis and treatment decisions are not influenced by financial incentives. That is to say, economists would say that that is a claim that there's no moral hazard, that decision-making is not affected by insurance or by subsidization. Now, this was once an empirical claim. When that doctor patted me on the head years ago when I started out in this field, now it's, as I'll explain later, it's not so much an empirical claim as a normative claim. Those who object to markets or incentives are typically making a normative claim that consideration of economics constitutes a corruption of medical judgment, inappropriate corruption of medical judgment. Now, the bottom line, and I'll talk about the consequences in a latter part of the talk, is that under the professional paradigm, doctors have controlled this system because of their scientific expertise and respect for their scientific expertise. Because of their economic leverage, they controlled patients, and doctors are beholden, hospitals rather, are beholden to doctors to fill beds. Market-based competition in such an environment led to increased costs because of competition for doctors' goodwill. This was often termed the medical arms race, where competition led to increased costs because the competition was not for cost containment, but to achieve goodwill with physicians. I now want to turn to the market model and its assumptions and implications. The market-oriented response to consumer ignorance is education and the improved flow of information, enhanced disclosure, and enhanced patient participation in medical care decision-making. And we're seeing that emerge, and the online tools have improved to allow enhanced patient participation. Because doctors had a very different view under the professional paradigm, they had to develop a label for this, which lawyers have long advanced as part of the expectation of consumer and informed decision-making, is that this is called the shared decision-making model. So that physicians are not in total control of the system, but they share decision-making authority with their patients. The consequence is that under this system, payers or consumers have more of a role in controlling decisions regarding levels of quality and overall levels of service and levels of quantity that are provided. The goal of the market model is that to develop a system where incentives are proper and private decision makers make both self-interested and socially appropriate decisions. And here is my kind of donkey example. And so if you remember nothing else about this talk, I hope you remember this donkey. We had to search quite a ways to find this in one of the libraries of figures. So think of our donkey. Think of a race between the owners of two donkeys. The prize money in the race goes to the owner of the donkey that finishes last. The person running the race blows the whistle, but as you would expect, neither donkey moves because the goal is to finish last. The person running the race thought of different options, appealed to the good faith of the parties, threatened that the term of entering into the race was good faith, and if they breached good faith, there could be a threat of prosecution. Nothing worked. So someone who's observing this whispered something in the ear of the person running the race. And then the whistle blew, the donkeys raced off at full speed to the finish line. And the riddle is, what did that person suggest to solve the problem? And I've been telling this story for a number of years, and twice has this been answered. But the riddle is, guess what? The person running the race had the owners switch donkeys. Okay, that changes the incentives, right? I'm riding your donkey, you're riding my donkey. We each want our own donkey to finish last. That means we're going to run to the finish line as fast as we can when I'm riding your donkey. That's my vision of how a market, the advantages of a market model. You don't need heavy regulation. You need to set a system where the incentives are right and where the players understand those incentives and act in accordance with them, and then you get a socially adaptive response. I hope everyone got that point of the riddle. Now I want to turn to some contributing factors related to the emergence of the market model. First, and I don't want to explain this, but in the questions I'll go through this if one wants. I have some good examples. Is the evidence that incentives make a difference. As I said, no longer would doctors pat me on the head, or any person who advocates use of incentives, and say they don't make a difference. The evidence is pretty strong that they do make a difference. Then the question is cost escalation. Cost escalation is observed in the professional paradigm because the professional paradigm is linked, as I'll explain later, to the development of third-party payment, and the development of third-party payment led to increases in utilization. In fact, it shows that the professional paradigm claim that there's no moral hazard was not right. The experience is that incentives make a difference, and that the blank check associated with, and I'll explain this later, Medicare, Medicaid, has led to higher costs, and higher costs led to more concerns by payers. Now I want to show graphically a graph that I have to footnote this. This was developed by Clark Havikhurst and me in a paper we did, I hate to say this, in the Northwestern Law Review 45 years ago. But it's still incredibly relevant and made a big difference in the TennCare reform that I'm going to mention later on. Here on the vertical axis, we have, and this is heuristic, it's not empirical, it's designed as a talking point, not to show empirical values. On the vertical axis are benefits, on the horizontal axis are costs. We have a cost line that shows the relationship between benefits and costs. And then we have a benefits curve that's designed to show at relatively low levels of inputs, there's a high increase in benefits. It continues to increase but flattens out at point X. That's where benefits are maximized. To the right of point X, between X and Y, are traditional notions of unnecessary care, zero benefit care. No one would advocate moving to the right of point X. There is some debate about what works and what doesn't work, but once we agree that something doesn't work, everyone would agree we shouldn't be beyond point X. And point Y is where benefits turn down. This is iatrogenesis, where the introduction of medical care is actually harmful, where you do the wrong procedure, where you cut off the wrong limb or something like that. Now, economists tell us that the slope of the cost line is marginal costs, and the slope of the benefit line is marginal benefits. And we have shown through the dotted line where the point of tangency of the benefit curve is where the slope of the benefit curve and the slope of the cost curve, marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit. And we've labeled this 0.0 for optimality. So economists would tell us that we should be at 0.0 on the benefits curve. Now, what's a significance of 0.0 is that additional benefits could accrue between 0.0 or 0 rather, and X is what we labeled the quality cost no man's land. Economists would say those are benefits, they're increasing benefits, but they're not worth the cost. Traditionally, under the paraprofessional paradigm, doctors have advocated that we should provide care up to point X, and they've labeled moving to the left of point X towards 0.0 as rationing care in a very pejorative manner. And so politicians prefer to talk about waste control, which is moving, getting rid of unnecessary care. But the honest debates are what is 0.0 and where between 0.0 and point X should we be as a society? And that is to say, whereas the X to Y is waste control, 0.0 to point X is cost control. And cost control suggests that there are certain things that should be left on the table. My favorite example, years ago, when there was discussion of national health insurance, an article was written, maybe the best term of an title of an article, called National Health Insurance and the Sixth Stool Guaiac. Stool Guaiac is a test for colon cancer. And I'll make up these numbers, but you can do several stool guaiacs and they're all the same price, but you buy less information. So at some point you may get up to 70% certain, 80%, 90%, but you never get beyond to 100%. And so the question is, should national health insurance pay for that sixth stool guaiac, which is the same price as the first one, but it only buys you information that gets you, so let's just say, from 95% certain to 96% certain. And that's really the debate about cost containment. And from an economic point of view, the kind of issue that we're talking about in scope of coverage. All right. Now I want to mention clinical uncertainty. The assumption of the professional paradigm is that we have clinical certainty, but those of you who have experienced the Dartmouth Atlas, pioneered by Jack Wenberg at Dartmouth and been replicated by his colleagues, this has undermined the claims of the scientific expertise and suggested a greater role for consumer choice. We've seen a shift in payment systems over the years, starting in the 1980s with the DRGs and the notion of capitation, that you pay a flat amount per member per month. These all suggest that economics have an important role to play. And in the Affordable Care Act, the emphasis on value-based payment and bundled payments are examples of that type of shift in payment based upon economic thinking. And then finally, selected legal doctrines contributed to the emergence of the market model. I've mentioned informed consent, especially the consumer-oriented informed consent, but I also want to mention antitrust. Antitrust I've called, in other work, the engine of the market paradigm. Antitrust law applies to trade or commerce, and the Supreme Court has held that the practice of medicine, like the practice of law in the Goldfarb case, is trade or commerce, and therefore it suggests that healthcare is an industry and that economic considerations and economic factors matter and are important in public policy. So now let me talk about cost issues and consideration of economic trade-offs. economic trade-offs have often been seen as dismal, kind of tracking the notion of economics as the dismal science, that cost containment is now seen, and I think the ACA is the high watermark of this, as an access issue. The proponents of the Affordable Care Act had a budget that they wanted to live within, and they needed to pay for the expanded access. And almost 50% of the pay-fors in the Affordable Care Act are from reductions in the rate of increase in payments under Medicare. So expanded Medicaid and other access issues, subsidies and so forth, were being paid for by not reductions, but reductions in the rate of increase in Medicare. Also, failure to recognize the reality of economic incentives can have significant effects that are very troubling. And I want to mention in this regard the Muse case. When I teach health law, this is how I start the class. This is a case of Joe Muse, who had suicidal thoughts, was admitted to a mental health facility, Charter Medical, and his insurance, his parents' insurance, ran out. And Charter Medical was wanting to discharge him. And under the non-abandonment doctrine, they had to find an adequate alternative facility. But they suggested that Joe be treated in an outpatient facility, which was available, or an inpatient facility, a governmental facility, which was also available. And the question, when you think about the case, is why did they not admit him to an inpatient public facility rather than an outpatient? And the answer is that they were continuing to deny that economics was relevant. They said that he was being discharged because he was healthy, not because of his insurance ran out. The result was he went to an outpatient facility, wasn't adequately supervised, and committed suicide. So this is a tragic example of where the failure to recognize and come to grips with truthfully the economic reality that a hospital cannot afford in the long run to provide, or is not willing to provide, services which are not being paid for, constrained by the non-abandonment principle. They can't abandon a patient, but they can find alternative facilities that may not be quite as good quality. The government facility may not be as good as Charter, but at least it would be a proper level of scrutiny and service. And then thirdly, I want to mention the medical necessity. Medical necessity, I'm going to mention this, was typically seen as implementation of the professional model. That is to say, there's a single, that's scientifically determined, and there's a single scientific basis for diagnosis and treatment. When we were doing Medicaid reform under Governor Bredesen, and I was his outside counsel in that process, we defined medical necessity to include an economic dimension. And the court that was overseeing this process upheld this. There was at the time no federal definition of medical necessity for Medicaid. And here it is, the operative language. It must be the least costly alternative course of diagnosis or treatment that is adequate for the medical condition of the enrollee. Okay, so clearly it recognizes that costs are relevant, but if you can do something that is on an outpatient basis rather than on an inpatient basis, or if Tums is okay, you don't need a prescription for an antacid, you must use the least costly alternative. And then what is the standard of effectiveness? Not equality, but adequacy. It's not the standard that Bill Gates would use for his family. So it may be that the adequacy of, say, an aspirin for pain would not be quite as good as some alternative that would be prescribed. But the operant question, which is both normative and empirical, is whether the course of treatment is adequate. No one was advocating, or nor do I, schlock medicine, but it may very well be that TennCare was spending $100 million at the time, this was 15 years ago, on antacids. And Governor Bredesen said, that doesn't seem right. There must be another way. And as somebody whose life has been extended by an over-the-counter Gelusil, I'm not advocating this for anyone else, but for me, Gelusil is pretty inexpensive and it's not prescription, and that's what we had in mind. So what are the consequences of the assumption of the professional paradigm that drove Medicare and Medicaid? There is a linkage between Medicare and Medicaid to income support programs such as Social Security and aid to families with dependent children, now TANF. This linkage created the structure for government support for medical care, and that structure derives from the income support programs like Social Security and AFDC rather than a medically driven structure. And the linkage was explicit in terms of eligibility. Medicaid added a benefit for those on welfare, and Social Security added a benefit for those who are on Social Security. The assumption was that cash assistance and medical assistance were similar in character. Once you define eligibility, medical care expenses could be realistically projected with funding not affecting levels of utilization. That is to say, no moral hazard. The fact that there would be funding would not affect levels of utilization because this would be determined under the professional paradigm based on science, not based upon incentives. The assumption under the professional paradigm was that science controlled. Doctors uniformly would agree, and the assumption did agree on diagnosis and treatment decisions for specific conditions. The Dartmouth Atlas has called that into question for many, many conditions and procedures. The assumption is that there is a single correct answer that is based upon a form of scientific determinism, and we've seen that language come to the fore now based upon science. But we realize that science is a range of probabilistic judgments, not a point on a scale. And the word that I always react against is when a doctor will say, oh, this is a treatment that is indicated, suggesting it's the only right way to do things. Think of it as a lawyer. Would you ever say an S corporation is indicated in the circumstances? No, you'd say there are a lot of different options. The best one under the circumstances is an S corporation or an LLC based upon all considerations. The concept of scientific determinism was captured in the concept that I mentioned before of medical necessity, not the TennCare definition, which was a big breakthrough or a problem, depending on which side of the debate you're on. In short, the assumption was what doctors would order was based on science, and that a consensus existed about what treatments are indicated under a given set of circumstances. And within about 5 years or 6 years after Medicare and Medicaid were enacted in 1965, we saw expenses for Medicare and Medicaid had ballooned well beyond projections, and that attention then focused on controlling costs. And there was a major piece of legislation, the Professional Standards Review Organization, or PSRO legislation, enacted in 1972, primarily out of concern about costs and escalation of costs. Second consequence is that we saw, and I've mentioned this, that allowed for the development of third-party payment with minimal oversight. The flow of dollars through Medicare and Medicaid was assumed not to affect levels of utilization. You could only have an open-ended third-party payment system if you assumed under the professional paradigm that utilization would not be affected by levels of support. For Medicaid, the result was a structure of cooperative federalism, that there would be federal matching support and oversight, but that the program was administered by the states. But the lack of effect of funding on levels of utilization allowed for the Medicaid program design, which was an open-ended program design, an uncapped expenditure. State expenses were determined by hospitals, doctors, by the program, by medical necessity, And then it was the obligation of the federal government to match state program expenditures without limitation, as long as these expenditures were in the plan design. So this is an open-ended structure that could only be based upon professional paradigm. Then we have methods of reimbursement. And even the use of the term reimbursement is a good example of how we don't like to think of economic factors. You know, when I'm paid, I'm not reimbursed. If I get an honorarium or consulting gig, or if I'm paid by Vanderbilt, I'm not reimbursed by Vanderbilt, I'm paid by Vanderbilt. But doctors like to think of themselves as being reimbursed because that suggests that people are not making money. It's not an economic sector. They're being reimbursed. And you'll see discussions of physician reimbursement. Doctors were paid under Medicare under the basis of usual, customary, and reasonable fees. It allowed doctors to set their own fees, and this has been revised over the years to recognize the significance of costs. Hospitals were, in fact, reimbursed on the basis of cost. This has been revised to reflect considerations of cost. And then there were structural considerations, which I've alluded to. Medicaid is an open-ended entitlement. Federal matching is open-ended. And this has resulted in what I call the displacement of political accountability. States drive the federal budget so that when states decide how robust their Medicaid program should be, who should be covered beyond those who are mandated to be covered, the federal government is obliged to match those expenditures. So the states are driving the federal budget. At some point, the feds say this is a lot of money, and they have developed a certain floor. There are increased mandates. The ACA is a prime example of that. And then state budgets are being driven by the federal government. So then I want to talk about the Children's Health Insurance Program as an alternative structural model. This legislation passed in the 1990s is bipartisan. It was sponsored by Senator Kennedy, Democrat, Senator Hatch, Republican. They were political adversaries, but personal friends, and they came together on the Children's Health Insurance, or CHIP legislation. Different model of cooperative federalism. It is a capped entitlement program with a more flexible program design than Medicaid. Each state by formula receives an amount matched by the federal government for authorized expenditures. States are at risk financially if spending goes beyond the budgeted amount. It's a capped entitlement. The federal obligation is subject to the appropriations process. It's not on automatic pilot, as I'll explain in a moment. It's the political process that governs, and the level of appropriations are capped at that politically determined amount. Unlike Medicaid, where appropriations follow the expenditures, here the appropriations drive the level of expenditures. It's a clear recognition of the economic dimensions of medical care because a budget is set and it subjects medical expenditures to the political appropriations process. CHIP is not spending on automatic pilot. This builds on Medicaid's mandated managed care option, which Tennessee pioneered, and Tennessee got a waiver, but it was deemed to be so successful that within 3 years, mandatory managed care is available to any state without a waiver for its Medicaid program. And I like to draw an analogy to the economic dimensions of the ACA, in which, as I've said before, nearly 50% of the financing for additional access in Medicaid was paid for by reductions in projected spending in Medicare. Now I want to turn to the access problems that resulted from the ACA's expansion of Medicaid. In 2012, in the Supreme Court decision, NFIB versus Sebelius, states were allowed to opt in to expanded Medicaid without facing a penalty to pre-existing Medicaid funding if the states chose not to opt in. Under the ACA, states really didn't have a choice. The Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. The states have to be able to opt in or not without putting at risk pre-existing Medicaid. 12 states have opted not to expand Medicaid. Missouri and Oklahoma have voted to expand, but they've not yet done so. So at the end of the day, when Missouri and Oklahoma expand, the non-expanding states will number 10. As a result of this opt-in, because of the NFIB decision, under the Affordable Care Act, persons with incomes between 100% and 400% of poverty qualify for subsidy on the exchanges that were set in place by the ACA. But some persons with incomes below 100% of poverty do not qualify for ACA subsidies on the exchanges, and some persons with incomes below 100% of poverty are not eligible for traditional Medicaid. So that is, these uncovered persons have too little income to qualify for the ACA subsidies, too much income to qualify for Medicaid in some states, including Tennessee, that have not expanded Medicaid under the ACA. This is commonly called the coverage gap. Of the non-expanding states, some are quite large in population, such as Texas and Florida, and so the coverage gap affects 10 or 12 states with substantial populations, leaving many uncovered. Unwilling to take on the financial obligations of Medicaid, that's true in Tennessee, but they, as a result, do not benefit from funding under the ACA. Now, the terms of Medicaid expansion under the ACA are very attractive. It's a 90% federal match for newly eligible persons and was designed to lure states into the program, and 40 of the 50 states have been enticed into the program. They've voluntarily done this, but 10 have not, including some large ones like Texas and Florida. And states have been unwilling, and the non-expanding states have been concerned about the uncertainty associated with their flexibility, what happens once they opt in. And as I've been told by legislators of Tennessee and others, 10% of a big number is still a big number. And what I like to explain to my students is I could get a 90% discount on the Hope Diamond, but guess what? My wife isn't getting the Hope Diamond. So 10% of a big number is a big number. So I now want to conclude with discussions, and I have about 9 or 10 minutes. I want to conclude with discussion of the Tennessee's Medicaid waiver. I want to describe the original waiver in 1994. That was mandatory managed care. The goal was to incur savings moving from an unmanaged care situation to managed care. The idea was to take 20 to 25% of costs out of the system once you move to managed care. But once you've already transformed to managed care, the rate of increase goes up pretty much the way it did before. So you drive costs out of the system, you start from a lower baseline rate, but the level of increases then starts back in. And it took about 5 years for Tennessee to transform, 5 or 6 years, to transform to a managed care system. I've mentioned it's now universally available, and cost consciousness in Tennessee was viewed as an access opportunity. This was later replicated in the Affordable Care Act, where roughly 50% of the expanded access is funded by reduced rates of increase in Medicare expenditures. So what was the political deal in Tennessee? All the cost savings, 100% of the cost savings from managed care went into expanding coverage for the uninsured. This secured the support by Medicaid patient advocates who are on board, endorsed TennCare, and cost savings were accepted as part of the expansion and part of access. The modified waiver in the Bredesen administration, and for disclosure, I was involved as Governor Bredesen's chief outside lawyer on this matter, with the adoption of the Medicaid necessity standard, which includes cost considerations, and a necessary reduction, which was very painful in the coverage of non-Medicaid eligibles. So Tennessee is a non-expanding state. There was a significant coverage gap, as there is. Governor Haslam, also a Republican. Governor Breslin was a Democrat. Governor Haslam, who's out of office now, was a Republican. He proposed Medicaid expansion. The Republican legislature did not accept that expansion. Basically, legislators were worried about getting locked into participation in Medicaid, not knowing what they were buying, and getting no assurances that they would be able to change their mind and opt out of Medicaid if they thought it became too expensive. So as previously explained, some folks in Tennessee, like other non-expanding states, had too much income to qualify for Medicaid and too little income to qualify for subsidies on these ACA-based exchanges. Now, the truth in Tennessee has been that Tennessee has managed its costs based upon its waiver and based upon the medical necessity standard. But under the Medicaid matching formula, the state has not received matching funds because it's spending less. And if you spend less, there's not matching funds on those funding, on that amount of money. You're leaving money on the table. So the state sought a new waiver to allow it to benefit from these foregone ACA funds. And the Tennessee proposed a block grant. The strategy was to take on financial risk, but to share in the cost savings with the federal government. Tennessee was advocating 50-50 split. And some of the shared savings would be used to increase health insurance coverage for those in the gap. But the state, unlike in the original waiver, the state declined to commit to use 100% of shared savings for expanded health insurance coverage. It wanted to retain flexibility to use some of the shared savings for other spending priorities. This was a change from the political deal that allowed the initial waiver to secure support from patient advocates, and patient advocates have opposed the original waiver proposal, the block grant. This proposal was submitted to the Trump administration in November 2019, and it was approved in modified form 14 months later in January 2021. So what is the approved waiver? And this is my I will just explain this. Instead of a block grant, the federal government approved what they call an aggregate cap financing approach, so that this limits federal matching beyond an aggregate spending cap. Remember, under Medicaid, it's an open-ended spending cap, so federal matching is open-ended rather. Here, there's a cap based on recent state costs and enrollment for the covered populations. The cap allows for adjustments for cost and population, but importantly, the state is at risk financially if expenditures exceed the aggregate cap. So the state legislature approved this ultimately. It was willing to take this risk. It was not willing to take the risk of opting into Medicaid. So the state gets the benefit of management flexibility and administration. It also gets flexibility in administering pharmaceutical benefits. For example, it can use a closed drug formulary, excluding new drugs from the formulary, so long as at least one drug per therapeutic class is available. If the states save money from prudent management from projections, Tennessee shares in the savings in the range of 45 to 55% accruing to the state. And importantly, the shared savings are available to expand coverage. This was a restoration of the original TennCare political deal. So where does this place the TennCare waiver? It's not a block grant, it's an aggregate cap. In my view, this is really a transformation of the CHIP model, not perfectly, but largely a transformation of the CHIP model to Medicaid. It's a fixed maximum budget. The state takes on financial risk. The federal government's matching obligation is capped. It shares cost savings with the state. Tennessee takes on some financial risk, but it can benefit from its history of prudent management of program costs. And politically, the original program deal is reinstated. It's still not clear whether advocates for patients will agree to this new version. They opposed the original proposal, but I've not heard them take a position on the waiver as approved. So in conclusion, the new TennCare waiver expressly takes costs into consideration. It recognizes that costs enter into medical decision-making. It recognizes that shared savings can result in improvements to access. It reflects a decision by Tennessee to take some financial risk, but not the risk of expanding Medicaid. It makes use of an alternative model of cooperative federalism reflected in CHIP, adapting it to Medicaid. More broadly, it shows that managing program costs can pay dividends in terms of expanding access, like in the ACA more generally. And although not measured or perhaps not even measurable, the definition of medical necessity in TennCare plays an important role in the state's managing costs and expanding access to coverage through the new waiver. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Blumstein. As far as I can see so far, you've been extraordinarily clear, and there's no question. We do have one question that's just come in. What percentage of doctors are participating in TennCare?
Well, that's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. Before TennCare, it was in the just below 50%, 40 to 50% range. It's gone up, but it's not a huge amount. It's still an issue and a problem. But the doctors are facing less uncompensated care. And so I should know the number, but I don't know the number. It's higher than it was, but I don't have the exact number.
No worry. Let me offer a question of my own. As you know, this past year, the entire medical system has gone through all sorts of conniptions and paroxysms involving the coronavirus, and the various acts, including the CARES Act, radically changed some aspects of medical care, at least on a temporary basis. Do you foresee, or do you want to comment on any of the responses to the COVID-19 that might have a more permanent effect on the structure of medical care going forward?
Yes, I think there are two related areas, and there may be many more. I've not really gotten to nitty-gritty details of the law that Congress apparently is going to pass today. But the two are increased remote online doctor-patient interchange. That's become a necessity. It's met with approval by physicians, broadly speaking, their organizations. And I think we will see more of this kind of remote access going forward. It also allows for non-physician, and this is the second related part, it has created an incentive to change licensure law. This was part of the Clinton plan. Licensure law was going to be altered dramatically. Clinton's plan was not ever implemented. It was not part of the Affordable Care Act, but there's lots of pressure to include more liberalized licensure, both for professionals practice who are licensed in one state, securing approval for licensure in another state, and also other non-physician personnel responding. This is a way that you have Health MD and other kinds of licensing, and I've had supervised students doing programs. Business school students are very interested in trying to get apps involved where there's more patient involvement in physician-patient encounters, and that may necessitate some modifications in licensure law, or it may be that you can draft around it. But certainly non-Tennessee doctors or non-doctors from out of state are going to play an important role in these remote sessions.
Very good. Thank you very much, Professor Blumstein. Thank everybody. I thank everybody for attending. We will look forward to seeing the result of this lecture in the next couple of issues of the Elder Law Journal. And thank you everybody for attending, and I want to give Illinois a welcome and an applause to Professor Blumstein. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much.